to the studio. I'm Matt Ellsworth, and I'm here to talk to you tonight about something that we're going to call Noetic 101. It's a description of some of the early chapters of a book I've recently published. It's on Amazon. I have to clean up the format some, apparently, but I believe by the time you see this it'll be cleaned up. The book is entitled A Body of Language, Revealing the Common Mind of Mankind. The idea behind the book is what I'm going to explain in this first video, and in the rest of the series I'm going to describe different parts, different chapters, different facets of the book so that you can understand just where it was I was heading and what's inside. What happened was, as a graduate student, I was involved in a machine translation project. This was some years ago, in fact some decades ago. It was early in the science and art of machine translation. Nonetheless, my job was what we called a disambiguator, and I was a trained linguist analyzing and breaking down speech so that it could be seen mathematically by the computer. That just kind of prepared my mind. I finished my master's degree in Spanish. I took some German under that. And then I went off to study Arabic. And as I began studying Arabic, I noticed some things. I noticed some things that were similar in Arabic to things in other languages that I had studied. Because by that time I did speak, as I said, Spanish and some German. I noticed something that linguists call deixis. Now, deixis I've also called echolocation, using the term that the bats do with their pings, and echolocution. No, sorry, echolocution is what I call this. It is something that asks the questions, for example, who is where, when with what, all beginning with WH, and answering it with thou art there, then with that, all beginning with TH, and answering the questions beautifully. And one discovers that way that the WH, the sound wha, which came from the Latin qua, and is expressed in different forms in different languages that came from Latin, means I don't know. And if you mean to ask, I don't know the place, you would say W-H-E-R-E, where, the W-H meaning I don't know, and the air meaning place. You would ask, I don't know the thing, W-H-A-T, what? And you would answer it with T-H-A-T, that. And the same with W-H-E-N and T-H-E-N, W-H-O-U and T-H-O-U. Thou art there, then with that, perfectly answers who is where, when with what. So I had this in my head when I started learning Arabic. You can study deixis separately. And I began to see the same things in Arabic. And what was more interesting, even early in the study, was that I found that certain sounds, between speaking now common to English, had the same function in Arabic. In English we say this, and I had already learned from a study of deixis that this is the wrong word. It should start with an H, because he is here, and thou art there, and you are yonder, and all in answer to who is where. But the H of things near me, he is here, is in the Arabic word for this, hada. And I separated that out, and I said, well, wait a minute, where else does this tha show up? And I found that it had the same function as in English. It meant something that you can point to, something specific, or just say a thing, which I have since learned is an incorrect way of saying the English word thing, meaning a specific thing that I can point to. Well, alright, so I found that in Arabic. In English it's a curiosity. Deixis is a curious thing, but it doesn't go very far. The th in mother is not related to the th of this and that. And so on. The H of hair is not related to the H of he is here. English is kind of messed up. Its history went wrong somewhere in the Middle Ages, I suppose. But Arabic, when you go back to its early language, what linguists call a proto-language, there aren't many stops along the way. There aren't many generations in its ancestral tree. The names that were given to speakers of early Semitic languages, the languages of the Middle East, are the same now as they were 2,000 years ago. Really the same now. Mubarak and Muhammad and Hassan mean the same thing that they did a couple thousand years ago. There's a couple of reasons for that. One of them is that the language was kind of frozen by the Quran in the 7th century. And another simply is that there just hasn't been a lot of conquest and passing through and stopping off and control by other cultures. The Arabic culture has been pretty much preserved out in the Arabia Felix, out in the dry desert, and has been able to maintain itself quite purely. So what you have in Arabic is a linguistically conservative, a phonetically conservative language that has had its literature frozen in time for centuries. And so when you discover something in it, you discover something that through English you would have to pass through Old Norse and Teutonic languages back on the one hand, and then to Latin on the other, to get as far back as you do in Arabic simply by learning a couple things about the present language. Well, it was at that point then that I began to wonder, can these little pieces go into something more interesting than pronouns of place and nouns and adjectives of time and location? And early on, I found that it looked like they could. I could take ha, meaning near me, and v, meaning thing I can point to, and go into certain verbs, and yes, they began to make some sense. Well, when that happened, I went to one of the instructors at the institute where I was, and I asked him, have you ever heard of a phenomenon where the letters of the alphabet have a meaning in themselves? And of course, I'm not talking about letters that you write on the alphabet, because one country might use a different symbol than another. I'm talking about the sounds that the letters represent, the sounds of the alphabet. And he said, I got to the right person. Thank you, Seymour Moskowitz of the Defense Language Institute. He said, yes, I've seen a book. It's in the library here. You should go see it. It was written by 4 men in Germany. In 1969 it was published, which wasn't that much before this time that I was searching. And they said, you know, there is a phenomenon described in Arabic, in the Semitic languages. Now everybody's known about it for 1,000 years or more. And it's called al-ishtiqaq al-akbar, the greatest declension, or the greatest, well, let's leave it at that. You can look up declension, because the greatest, well, I'll describe it. Al-ishtiqaq al-akbar. It was a phenomenon that said when you get a bunch of words in Arabic that share a single letter, or even 2 letters, any of the 2 or 3 that are in the root of the word, when you get them all together, they kind of have the same meaning, or their meanings are related. In English, this would be like saying brick and bark and break and curb and carob mean pretty much the same thing because of the C and the B and the R. Well, it's just not true in English, but in Arabic it is. And they said, this must be because there is sense in the letters individually. So they pointed out to several authors who had mentioned it now for over 1,000 years. One of them being a man called Ibn Jinni, who had truly 1,000 years ago said, this thing exists. But even at that time, no one could say what the meanings of the letters were. I, however, had a good start. I was a disambiguator, and I knew what several of the letters began to indicate. It didn't matter that I was wrong, because in fact I was wrong. But I was able, bit by bit, to isolate the letters. Using lists of words, I looked at recurring meanings. Looking at knowing one of the letters, I isolated the second one in the word, until finally, bit by bit, and after some years, I came up with a pretty good understanding of what the meaning of each sound, represented by the letters in the alphabet, means. And to my happy astonishment, I found out that in fact the early indications were correct. The meanings that they have in Arabic, Hebrew, other Semitic languages, are identical to the meanings that they have in English, and therefore Indo-European, the European language as a whole. So what I'm describing in the book, A Body of Language, is, well, there I reveal the meanings of each letter in the alphabet, and I tell how they mean the same thing whether the language is English or Arabic or French or Spanish. Now, I'm not talking about the languages of the Far East. I don't know them well enough. The Sino-Altaics, the Finno-Ugrics, even in the Eastern European locations, or the Hamitic, Cushitic languages, the Nilo-Hamitics in Africa. I don't know them, so I can't say. But I invite anyone who wants to look into it. And so I think for this first explanation, that about does it. I just want to tell you it's called A Body of Language, and I will describe more. I'll go chapter by chapter in further videos, and we'll explore the meaning of R, and the meaning of M, and the meaning of L, and we will explore the syntax that was apparently used very, very early, as early as ancient Sumer, to form words. I don't have an explanation for what came before that, or how anybody on that particular day that this was first used was sapient enough to come up with this system of language, but I can show you that it exists. In fact, I give you evidence that it does exist. So I invite you to see the book. I invite you to follow this series of videos. Thank you very much.